Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and the discussion so far has been just really interesting and important. So when we think about pension funds, their long-term horizons means they have particular exposure to the long-lived effects of many of the ESG risks. And an important example would be the risk that comes from climate change. And the fact that the the pension funds have such consequences of what can happen if they're underfunded, it leaves them particularly exposed to the ESG related downside risk. And so that I wanted to present some evidence that my co-author Zach Sautner and I have developed, along with some evidence that Zach has developed with some other people. But just to start, and this was talked about earlier this morning, but risk can really be seen more clearly through an ESG lens. And there are a number. I've listed some of the risk here. The one I'm more focused on today would be climate risk. And then beyond these types of risk that we can, if we use this ESG lens, we can see more clearly. It's the components of risk have been found to be affected differentially by ESG issues. So there's some evidence that systematic risk, it varies according to companies' ESG profiles. And for example, there are those that say that ESG firms, high ESG firms, are more resilient, and thus don't face as much systematic risk. And also because of that, they don't face as much of the downside or tail risk. There's some evidence showing that some of the risks that firms can be particularly vulnerable to, such as environmental disasters, human rights, privacy, or fraud, high ESG firms are not as vulnerable to those. But the risk that looms largest for pension funds in the long run are climate risk. And I know everybody knows this, but this graph is just so striking and showing that, we can go back 800,000 years and we have the same, the atmospheric carbon was pretty low until in recent decades. And so the climate risk has become much more of a focus. But the problem is that although climate risk can adversely affect asset values, particularly for long-term investors like pension funds, it's very difficult to price and hedge. And that's because of its systematic nature, because there's not enough disclosure by the firms that they're holding in their portfolio, and it's difficult to find a suitable hedging instrument. So not surprisingly, climate risk has become a first order topic for policymakers. So when we think about climate risk and downside risk, as I said, this is particularly important for pension funds and any investors who need to match their assets with their liabilities and have these downside risk constraints. So these downside risks are also relevant for institutional investors more broadly. We can think about banks and insurance companies, and one problem is that we've typically used this mean variance framework, but the returns are typically skewed, particularly in the face of the downside risk. So my co-authors, Philip Kruger and Zach Sautner, and I wanted to understand how investors approach climate risk. And so we developed a survey, and there are a lot of questions in this survey. I'm just going to show the answers to a few of them. And this is in the Review of Financial Studies. But this was large institutional investors from around the world. We had 439 respondents. We had a large percentage of the largest investors that were in this survey. And so as you can see, they have very different, they have a wide variety of approaches to how they're going to incorporate climate risk into their investment process. And just looking at the top one, which was analyzing the carbon footprint of portfolio firms, we also found, which was the most common approach, but we also found that that some of these investors reduce the carbon footprint of their portfolio firms. So besides analyzing them, they also reduce them. The second most common was to analyze stranded asset risk. And again, we found that some of the investors were also working to reduce their stranded asset risk. I should point out that only 7% of the respondents were doing nothing about incorporating climate risk into their investment process. So they could choose different choices on this, and we found, not surprisingly, that some approached it through their general portfolio diversification and their ESG integration. But it's also the case that if you look at divestment, which has been widely argued by some to be the way to approach climate risk, we only found 20%. It was the lowest of the choices in terms of what the investors were selecting. We also asked the investors about engagement and how they're engaging firms on climate risk. And we found that only 16% didn't have any type of engagement on climate risk. And this result is strikingly similar to, Zach and I have another survey on institutional investors on their corporate governance and engagement activities in the Journal of Finance a few years ago. And it was about 16% in that one when we asked about engagement on corporate governance. In this case, we ask about engagement on climate risk. And again, we find that most investors, the vast majority, are engaged. Now, we did survey large investors. They're not the same group across the two. I mean, there'll be commonalities, but we didn't go back exactly to the same group. So not surprisingly, we found that the most common approach was to talk to management about the financial implications of climate risk. And then within that, there were those that would propose specific actions to management on climate risk issues. We also found that that it was common for the investors to vote against management, to submit shareholder proposals, and to question management and conference calls, or just to publicly criticize them. I should also say that Zach and I have some other research on engagement on ESG risk, where we find that we actually measure the downside risk with other co-authors. We measure the downside risk and find that when firms are engaged, their downside risk of ESG, and particularly environmental, has been reduced. Another question which we thought was important was to understand the perceptions of stranded asset risk. So we took the industries that would seem to have the highest probability of having stranded asset risk. And we asked the investors their perceptions about stranded asset risk in these industries. And so this graph shows the percentage of respondents that believe the stranded asset risk is very high in the industry. And we found that 25% for the coal producers, 25% of the investors felt stranded asset risk was high for coal producers, and then we can see that it was also high for the unconventional oil producers, and then other energy firms as well. So in terms of the pricing of climate risk, Zach and some co-authors looked at, for the firms, 100 firms account for 71% of global industrial greenhouse gas emissions. And you can see that from this. This is scope 1 intensity, carbon intensity across firms. So they were particularly interested in this group and found that higher carbon intensity increases the price of downside protection by looking at put options and the slope of the volatility curve in the put option market, and found that. They also found that after the Trump election, when you would think that there was a change in this regulatory uncertainty, that it actually that the pricing went down. So they found that carbon risk is priced. Looking at these put options, that there was a concern about the protection, and that this price changes when regulatory uncertainty changes. So in conclusion, we think that pension funds should care about downside risk, and that ESG gives a lens onto this downside risk, which allows for a better understanding of the sources and allows for a better understanding of how they can be addressed through risk management or engagement. And a key focus for pension funds should be on the downside risk related to climate change.